This is the Environmental Justice in Iowa panel. It's a diversity, equity, inclusion on the DEI track. If you're keeping track of what sessions you're in, we do have a sponsor, DEI sponsor here. So our room host will share his screen, and when we're done looking at the sponsor's video, I'll introduce our panel.
Hi friends, Angelica Veneta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to check out our website at inclusivicr.org for upcoming events and our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
All right, and we're back here. I'm going to introduce our panel according to the order that everybody appears on my screen. I'm not sure it's the same for everybody, but let me start with Silvia. Silvia Setchi is a professor at the University of Iowa in the Geographical and Sustainability Sciences. Her research includes many things, but especially topics we're interested in here today of water and food systems. Silvia, I understand that members of your class are with us today, and I want to give a shout out to them. Which class is this?
This is Geography 2013, Introduction to Sustainability, and we talk about how sustainability has to be just, as in justice, and incorporate social elements. So this is a really fitting panel for them to sit in on.
Good. And speaking of sustainability, another of our panelists is Tamara Marcus. She is Linn County's first ever sustainability manager, and comes on board just in time for the Drake show to hit, and the climate action plan that the county is embarking on. And among many other things, Tamara was a Fulbright scholar. And if I remember this correctly, you went to the Himalaya Mountains and studied there. So that's a big culture change, obviously, from fields of Iowa. So welcome. And then our last panelist is Josh Mandelbaum. He's a senior attorney for the Environmental Law and Policy Center based in Des Moines. And his focus in that group is on clean energy and clean water. And those are certainly all topics that we're interested in here today. My name is Craig Jamolis. I'm the managing editor of the Gazette newspaper, which means I run the day-to-day operations of the newsroom. And welcome everybody to our annual Iowa Ideas Conference. We're in the final stretch today. And I hope people got to see a lot of sessions yesterday, and we still have a few more to go today after this. Let me start our conversation first by, this kind of illustrates to me anyway, illustrates the concept of environmental justice. We had a story in the Gazette over the summer, and other people did as well, that there's a researcher at the University of Iowa, a very well-known water quality researcher, and he had written on his blog, and some other people have picked this up as well. We've talked about water quality in Iowa, it seems like forever. But it was really the first time that there was kind of the spotlight shined on it from a racial issue, an environmental justice issue. where the concept of it essentially was that we have a lot of landed white gentry farmers in Iowa that are creating, as a result of their operation, nutrients that are polluting the water downstream and affecting communities, specifically Ottumwa, which is the town I grew up in, which is on the Des Moines River, and has become much more racially, ethnically diverse since when I grew up there. There's a meat packing plant there, and I think it's in Wapelli County, which is the poorest county in all of Iowa, and Ottumwa is one of the poorest cities in Iowa, and the community is about 14% Hispanic, 5% Black, and the rest of it more or less pretty much white. But the whole concept of this being an environmental issue that disproportionately affected people of color got some blowback from the state about no, we shouldn't introduce race into this at all. I just thought that was a very interesting environmental justice question. And I wonder if any of our panelists might want to address kind of what that tells you about the state of environmental justice in Iowa right now, and what does it inform you about where things need to go next? I don't know who wants to take that question first, but Silvia, since you're really familiar with it, I wonder if you want to talk about that for a minute.
Yes, and I will preface this by saying that Dr. Jones is a personal friend and a close collaborator, and one of the people I respect the most in the state and actually at the national level for his work, really not taking any crap when it comes to water-related issues. If you will excuse my pun, this is one of our inside jokes all the time, talking about crap. So just for the context here is really critical to where we are in Iowa, because we're talking about the intersection between agriculture and food, right? And the whole supply chain. One of the big users, in fact, I think it's the biggest user of water in Ottumwa, is the meatpacking plant, where a lot of the people of color in Ottumwa work, right? And so we have this kind of like upstream, downstream that really reflects upstairs, downstairs dynamics. The farmers pollute upstream. Given the way the lawsuit of the Des Moines Waterworks went, they kind of know that they can pollute with impunity, regardless of who is in power, Democrats or Republicans. And then we have these urban areas in Iowa who are the ones actually growing, that have to put up with extra work. The Ottumwa plant has issues because they have to deal with all those nitrates that come in. So we have an aging infrastructure. We have minority people who do a lot of the work that actually is critical, right? Essential work. They were essential workers during COVID. They produce our food as much as the farmers do. But when you look at the conversation, it's all about the farmers. And in fact, even this morning, somebody was telling me the poor farmers, they're victims of the system, when they, in fact, they are pretty rich people. They are land rich. In Iowa, the land prices keep going up, right? And they are catered to in our institutions. We talk a lot about the farmers. We don't talk a lot about the other issues related to the quality of the water, the infrastructure that has to clean the water for the majority of Iowans, and how we, I would say the other part of this story is in Iowa, we have a pretty strong tell in general. We say, oh, we don't see race, which is actually a tell for being racists. And when you point that out, legislators get their feelings hurt and want to retaliate.
On a broader level, taking that whole back and forth on this, taking that to a broader level about environment in general, and not just on water quality, but in general. Is it fair to be introducing race into the equation about environment? And that seems to be the key question here. Is it a socioeconomic issue only? Is it a race issue also? Are they intertwined? And that really gets to the heart of what you consider to be justice, I think. Is it fair at all to bring race or ethnicity into this equation at all?
Well, I'll jump in here. So, Silvia, you mentioned upstream and downstream, and you were kind of speaking about water quality, but it really does remind me of this kind of top-down and bottom-up change. And so if we look at, the environmental justice movement, this is people of color, this is based in people of color taking control, taking back power over decisions that, as you mentioned, Craig, disproportionately often impact communities of color. And so I think, it's not very surprising to me to see the people who are least impacted by some of these decisions, not thinking that things like race, things like socioeconomic status play a factor in creating more just systems. And I think, we've seen kind of since the murder of George Floyd, the social justice movement really start to merge into, into the environmental movement, right? Which has traditionally been middle-class white people who have been leading a lot of that work, right? So really making this bigger than just, I like to go outside, I value nature, and so we should preserve these things. But actually, when we dive down into the details, right, this is not, it's not a recreational luxury that a lot of people who are, again, impacted by these decisions are concerned about, right? It's, you mentioned clean water. Yes, that is recreational in some aspects, but obviously if we look at Flint, Michigan, right, we see that this is actually a health issue. And so clean water is more than just, wanting to go swimming in a lake, wanting to take our boats out or all of these very fine things, but also it's deeper than that. And I think that we are starting to realize that as a collective society. Sorry, it says my internet is unstable, so if it starts cutting out, please let me know. We're starting to realize that it's bigger than just, going out into nature and appreciating it in that way. And it is tied to health. It is tied to, financial security as well. If you look at the impact of derecho in Linn County, specifically on utility bills, right? We see just in the last year that utility bills are going up because of that loss of canopy. And so, yes, for something like trees, we all kind of have felt that loss of, the impact of that loss of canopy. And also, it's not just a feel-good thing. It's also really a financial thing, right? A security thing. And so that's when we start to see, issues of environmental sustainability start to tie into issues of social justice. And I'll maybe stop there and let Josh, I know that you have some things to say.
You touched on a lot of issues there, and I want to come back to and unpack some of these because so many things you mentioned are really full discussions in their own right. So we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I think I want to get to some of them. But let me ask Josh to amplify on that if you want to. But I also want to get from your perspective kind of where do you think we stand in Iowa in terms of environmental justice? Is it just a concept that's beginning to unfold here? Has already progress been made? Do we have obstacles in the way? I kind of want to get your legal perspective on that, but feel free to amplify on what Tamara just said.
Well, I think we've got a lot of work to do on that front. I think we have a lot of work in Iowa to do just purely from an environmental movement perspective. And then when you think about environmental justice, which has been a part of the environmental movement for decades, but often, quite honestly, it has not been given its due in a lot of cases. And so when you have an environmental movement that is smaller in a state like Iowa, environmental justice has even more trouble coming to the forefront, but it's absolutely critical. I mean, what Tamara was talking about, I mean, we need to be talking about who faces the consequences of pollution, which is something that we don't talk about a lot in this state. When you think about the water quality issues and the connection to utility bills, I mean, Silvia pointed out, we have communities in this state that are paying more to treat their water because of the pollution, the upstream pollution. And that doesn't fall evenly on everyone. The increase in utility bills is going to impact some people more than others. And I think also where we're headed, I mean, this problem is continuing to get worse. We're not taking the action that we need to solve our water quality problems. And I think we're pushing to situations, like, for example, I think we're going to see communities lose their drinking water for periods of time, just with the trajectory we're going. And so if you have a community that says, okay, now you have to go get bottled water to have safe drinking water for the next 3 days, who does that impact the most? And again, it's the same, it's disproportionate in terms of race and socioeconomic status. So those issues are very much part of what we need to be talking about and we need to be addressing. And I think the environmental movement is more aware of that and talking about that more, but I think we're behind where we should be and have been. Similarly, we do a good job talking about renewable energy in this state, but we don't necessarily do a good job talking about who has access to that renewable energy. Distributed solar is a great technology, but it's not always accessible in a lot of different ways, right? There's a high upfront cost. If you live in an apartment building or a shared building, you don't necessarily have the ability to have an installation, even if you can afford the upfront cost. There are a lot of different pieces there, and we need to be thinking about, from a policy perspective, from how we expand access and allow low-income communities and communities of color to have just as good access to our renewable energy economy as everyone else. And then as we transition, we need to think about the job transition for the folks who are working in old dirty power plants, and think about what comes next for them as well. That's also a piece of a just transition in this broader conversation. So there are a lot of different components, and I think we're starting to have those conversations, starting to have a deeper understanding of it, but it hasn't necessarily been at the forefront in the past.
If I may, I want to bring together two things that Tamara and Josh said, because we've talked about Ottumwa, but I think we should talk about Des Moines, because we haven't really framed the issue of water quality in terms of environmental justice in Des Moines, but it has a very strong environmental justice component. The city of Des Moines is abandoning the Raccoon River and is going to use groundwater to provide drinking water to people there and all the other people in surrounding areas. And there is an environmental justice component there because of all the people of color who live in Des Moines who are going to get higher rates because of the pollution that's coming from upstream. So going back to what Tamara was saying, this is a different lens through which to see things that we're learning ourselves, right? And I'm white, so a lot of us are kind of like blind to these issues, and we need to be educated and be willing to be educated and understand these disproportionate impacts. And I think that's where the work really needs to happen, that people don't just have a knee-jerk reaction, oh, I don't want to hear about it, it hurts my feelings. We really need to do the work. And frankly, white people need to shut up and learn a lot in Iowa.
It's interesting that I think that with the derecho not too distant in our rearview mirror, I do think that was one of the major environmental things that happened here that may cause more attention to the very key question of environmental justice of different people being affected differently by the same event. And so, and Tamara might be able to talk about this some more, but the derecho came through, affected everybody, but didn't affect everybody equally. And I mean, we had, I'm just going by the stories we wrote. It seemed like every day there was something else that was unbelievable. You had houses that lost their roofs and people living in tents outside. And you had people without electricity for days on end. For me, it was inconvenient. For somebody who has a medical device, it was a life-threatening thing. And I wonder, Tamara, I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more about, because you were really in the throes of the derecho and what you saw happening and how that informs us going forward in terms of what issues did that raise that we need to make sure that get addressed in some way, shape, or form down the line.
Yeah, well, Craig, I think you hit the nail right on the head. You said, and I've said this time and again, and I'm sure I will continue to say it. Everyone experienced the derecho. It impacted every square mile of Linn County, but that impact was very different, depending on honestly what resources you could access. And so I did start my position a week after the derecho, so I got to kind of experience the aftermath cleanup that local governments were involved in, and some of that ongoing resilience planning that has been happening. I guess almost a year and a half since the derecho. But then also with our nonprofit, we were immediately on the ground giving out resources, food, diapers, water, tarps, tents, grills, because it was a disaster zone for weeks after that event. And some people, got their roads cleaned up very quickly, and others still are still trying to, recover from that disaster. And I think when we spoke a bit about this in our group before this larger call, but obviously the physical infrastructure is important for us to consider, but also the social infrastructure is just as valuable. And disruptions to the social infrastructure are a lot harder to repair. And what I mean by social infrastructure is, thinking about people who are living in these apartment complexes who are already vulnerable to, to not only climate change, but other social vulnerabilities due to economic status, education, access to jobs, et cetera, physical ability. So these are folks that likely are dependent on their neighbors for something, and vice versa, right? We have these complex social infrastructures that, I work nights, and so my neighbor watches my kid while I'm working, and then I cook dinner on Sunday, right? And so when you have, entire apartment complexes falling down, when you have entire mobile home parks destroyed, yes, you can move that individual, yes, you can move those families, but that repair of that social dependency is a lot harder to address. And so all the more reason when disaster events like this happen that are arguably driven by climate change, to highlight that this is why we should care, right? Because we now, the flood of 2008, the almost flood of 2016, the derecho, we're living in the in-between times. And so what we do between disasters matters, and we need to pay attention to that. It's not just as easy as, okay, there was a tree here, let's plant another tree next to it. We need to be asking the question of how we're creating communities, neighborhoods that are more resilient to disaster events. So things like, yes, the physical infrastructure of, putting in solar charging stations with backup generator power, figuring out how we create resiliency hubs or points within our community that we can start to activate in times of disaster is key. in between these times of disaster, and also recognizing that there are nonprofits, community organizations that can just react a lot quicker than most of our governments can. And so how do we build capacity within these organizations to ensure that when we need them the most, that they are ready? And the beauty of it is that often these, physical infrastructure, the social infrastructure with community orgs and nonprofits, yes, they become even more valuable during times of disaster, but also they serve a good during these in-between times too, right? So, the United Ways, the Catherine McCauley Centers, the ASJs, the Bridge Under the Bridges, and I'm kind of throwing out local nonprofits to Linn County, but for those zooming in, calling in, I know that you can think of, those nonprofits that just always seem to be there, right? And so how we again build capacity within these organizations, taking advantage of the lessons learned from our last disaster to create better points of resiliency in those structures, so that we're ready the next time, will be key.
Picking up on that a little bit, and also trying to weave in a question here from the audience. And just a reminder that please feel free to submit your questions, and I'll try to sprinkle these in as we go along here. But picking up on that, and a question that was submitted here, which I'll reword a little bit to try to follow up on this. We did have the flood in 2008. We actually did have a flood in 2016, but after spending millions of dollars in a short period of time, we actually didn't see the huge effects of it. But we actually did have a flood. It just didn't inundate 10 square miles in town. And of course, we had the derecho that everybody is all too familiar with. I'm not aware of this, but somebody was asking, have there been any studies that have looked into this unequal resilience to hazards? I know that everybody's done varying degrees of an after-action report after the derecho, but I'm not aware, and maybe our panelists are aware of any kind of empirical study that has looked at what is the type of unequal resilience that is out there in the community? Or are we kind of doing it by anecdote, or is there, I don't know if anybody is actually studying this?
Well, actually, somebody is studying that. My colleague, Eric Tate, in my very department, he looks at natural hazards and vulnerability in this kind of like disproportionate impact issues, he's doing work both in Iowa and more at the national scale. I'm not sure that he has anything specific for Cedar Rapids, but if you look him up, he has a paper that just came out this year on social vulnerability and short-term disaster assistance at the national level, and one on flood exposure and social vulnerability at a national level. So I think some of his more local work is still going on because it has a much larger kind of like empirical component on the ground, components on the ground. But we are looking into these, and there is a lot of literature that shows that for the reasons that Tamara brought up, it's a lot harder to relocate. It is a lot more difficult to move to higher ground, if you will, right? These impacts tend to be much higher, and the long-term impacts tend to be much higher, right? It's a lot harder to get yourself out of the hole that these disasters have created financially and in terms of community-wide. So look up Dr. Eric Tate.
Okay, that's interesting.
One thing that part of this discussion that I think is also worth flagging, and it's related to both the resiliency, also sort of how you build back, the broader discussion about our tree canopy and inequities in our tree canopy that exist in communities all across Iowa and across this country. If you look at the places that have traditionally had the largest tree canopy, it tends to be the wealthier, wider parts of our communities. And the places that lack tree canopy, in a lot of places, we talk about the urban heat island effect. Because of the lack of trees, when the high temperatures hit communities, it doesn't impact every part of the community the same way. It tends to impact the places without trees, which also tend to be places where there are more people of color, more people who are of a lower socioeconomic status. And it goes to the efficiency and utility bill question. It has multiple impacts and multiple pieces of disproportionality. But the other piece to come back to, particularly after a natural disaster like the derecho, where we're going to be talking about planting a lot more trees as a response, how do you make that equitable, right? And how do you do that in a way, because there were already places in our community that should have had trees, that would have benefited from those trees, but that didn't. And so it can't just be when you build back and when you respond that you focus on where the trees were lost, but you focus on the broader impact and really addressing some of the systemic issues that we're already missing in our tree canopy and in that discussion.
That's interesting. This kind of all fits under the umbrella of climate change, right? Floods and derecho and the natural environment, the built environment. We're very much in the throes of climate action plans and setting goals for the future, which a lot of people say are too late as it is, but at least we have some goals out there. The question I have is, we've talked about how climate events disproportionately affect different people, right? Everybody experiences it differently, and not everybody has the seat at the table or the voice they should have to talk about the building back plans. My question is, so I think we know that's an issue that needs to be addressed. When we talk about transitioning to, for instance, more electrical vehicles, more greenhouse gas reductions, is there as we transition to that, to meet these goals, are you concerned about the transition itself having a disproportionate effect? We're trying to solve a disproportionate effect, but is there even more of it to come during the transition where people may lose jobs, electric rates are going to continue to go higher, tariffs, we may see new tariffs that we didn't have before. Is there concern about getting to those goals we've set in terms of does it help environmental justice or make it worse to get there?
I think that is absolutely correct. So, again, going back to what Tamara was saying at the very beginning, a lot of times these environmental concerns do not adequately incorporate social concerns. And so we've seen this before. For example, when we passed the amendments to the Clean Air Act in the 1990s, right? They had great effects in terms of air quality, reducing our acid rain, improving, reducing mortality and morbidity. They were a great policy, but we really didn't do very much for the coal miners that were displaced by the lowering of use of high sulfur coal in places like Southern Illinois, where I used to live. And so a lot of those places have never gotten back up. If we talk about a carbon tax, just a straight carbon tax, would disproportionately affect poor people, right? Because they spend a lot more of their income on high fossil fuel things like transportation and heating and so on and so forth. So if you don't think of the policy from the get-go with these kind of issues in mind, you could have massive unintended consequences in terms of inequality impacts.
One of the sidelights to this is that I lived for most of my adult life in Florida. I grew up in Iowa, went to the University of Iowa, my alma mater, but then immediately moved to Miami and worked as a reporter and editor for most of my adult life in Florida until I moved back here to Iowa. And one of the things that kept me up at night was we had hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. It seemed like I was there for Hurricane Andrew that came through Category 5 through Miami. And I was in Tampa when we had that year what I like to call the conga line of hurricanes. We had 4 come through. And after all those natural disasters, there's constantly a look at the building codes. And I think I may be wrong, but I think Iowa just has one building code that applies to the entire state. In a place like Florida, where there's a building code that applies to South Florida, which is right on the coast, and the building codes elsewhere. The current building code we have here doesn't require windows and structures to withstand as high of a wind gust as we saw in the derecho. It's still pretty high, but not that high. And talking about regulations and unintended costs, if we were ever to increase the building code requirement so that structures didn't have the roofs blown off and people living in tents outside, that seems like it goes counter direction to affordable housing. It drives up cost. And I think the same thing with the switch to electrical vehicles. I was just in a panel yesterday where the one thing everybody agreed on was that the demand for electricity is going to continue to go up and up and up. And it's going to be more expensive to get more transmission lines, more distribution, bury lines as much as possible. And the costs are going to go up and up and up and up. When you talk about climate action plans, how much of the plan, and Tamara, you might be able to address some of this, how much the plan contemplates the fact that there's going to be a disproportionate cost impact in all this?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I think it really is left up to whoever is leading that plan, right? And I think it's important to remember that addressing climate change is not something that anyone has successfully done.
Right.
This is all kind of a iterative process of, okay, I think this is the direction we should take. Is it having the impact that we want? Yes or no? And then, acting accordingly. And so I think that for Linn County, I can speak to so we had our first resolution declaring a climate emergency, which basically created my position at the county, which is very similar to what you might see in the Paris Agreement with some of the CO2 reduction goals. But there's not a lot of language around how to do that in the first resolution. And so when I started, we actually wrote a second resolution prioritizing vulnerable communities and climate action planning. And so what this is meant to do is attempting to decentralize the decision-making power. And so again, this kind of speaks to, I see this as tied to the value of investing in our social infrastructure. There are people, like, I think we all are humble enough to realize that we don't know everything, right? That's unrealistic for us to imagine every issue that would come up. Because we all have very different life experiences. And so the more that we can create systems to allow real people who are actually impacted by not only disasters, but the decision-making or the impacts of the policies, the more that we bring these individuals into that decision-making process, the better we can create policies that won't create further inequity, right? And so this is a challenge, right? Because this is not something that, at least from my experience, that I've seen done well in any form of government and any level of government. But again, I think it speaks to the iterative nature of this work, where we recognize that, hey, yeah, maybe these access to renewables is not what it should be, right? Access to solar is not what it should be. Access to EV is not what it should be. And so how do we create systems that not only try and address that issue, but more importantly, how do we create pathways to ensure that those voices that are impacted by those decisions are being heard? And I know, Josh, you have some interesting ideas too. I think we talked about a revolving fund as well. And I think that kind of that's kind of a good best practice that we can do at local government, but it's a both and, right? It's a do your best for the people who are in power right now, right? And also I think it's the job of the people who are in power to be creating ways to get people who are not a part of this conversation, who don't have the time to care about these things because they're working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, they're caring for a sick loved one, whatever the reason may be. We need to make sure that we are getting their voice, bringing their voice into this discussion too.
Yeah, if I could piggyback and address a couple of these things. One,
Sure.
The premise that electrifying and electric vehicles is necessarily going to cost more isn't necessarily the case, right? I mean, we know, for example, that there are uneconomic coal plants being run in this state that we can save money for consumers if we retired them sooner. And we're not doing that. And that has a disproportionate impact. But there's all sorts of access questions because electric vehicles can be cheaper to operate and run, but there is a huge barrier to being able to access that. There's an upfront cost that's slightly higher right now, and you need access to the charging infrastructure. So there are folks who might save money over the life of a vehicle, but can't access it. And we need to think about that piece of it as well. I also wanted to talk about this in terms of the solutions and the climate plans that we have need to think about equity and bringing everyone along, because there are very, very much equitable solutions, but sometimes we don't equitably apply them. Energy efficiency is a great climate solution, and it's going to be even more impactful for utility burdened households to implement energy efficiency. And those are often the households that are least likely to have access to the energy efficiency programs.
Oops, Josh, you froze there. Hopefully he will come back. I do want to, we're going to run out of time here pretty soon, but I do want to talk about, I do want to get to the question about seats at the table and making voices heard and who gets to decide things or who should be deciding things. But I also want to talk, I think related to this is the whole question of food supply and food deserts. It's not maybe an obvious environmental justice issue, but we certainly have those here in Cedar Rapids and elsewhere also. And it's ironic that here we are in the breadbasket of the country, and yet so many people are struggling to get the right amount of food. We see it in the, we especially have seen it during the pandemic where schools are going out of the way to have provide meals to students, even though they weren't in class. To me, it's there's different ways of looking at this, but to me, it kind of comes under the headline of sometimes how expensive it is to be poor. That your neighborhood place to go get food may not be a grocery store. It may be like a Walgreens or a CVS or something where prices are 10 times what they would be elsewhere because it's convenient. Or you have to take public transportation to somewhere. It takes a lot of time. We do have some of those food deserts around here. And Tamara, especially, I wanted to talk to you and Silvia about that because I know you're passionate about this. And I just kind of wonder what your take on it is in terms of how big of a problem is that in our area? And what do you see being done, if anything, to try to resolve this question?
Silvia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about this. One is, I think we could do a lot more, and that would have benefits for both diversified farming and small farmers, and for our for the consumers of food, right? For example, Vermont has a really strong program essentially that brings together demand and supply, and they fund it. They put some real money in there, and so you have potential for institutional purchases. Greg, you were talking about the schools, right? So you could have better local food in the schools, so that you kind of like bridge that gap. In Iowa, our program is woefully underfunded. I think they pay for one full-time FTA person, So we have all this space where we're just growing corn and beans, and they cause all this pollution. So I think in terms of both local policies and state policies, there is a immense potential for growth here in Iowa that would both diversify the landscape, reduce pollution, bring back all sorts of good things in rural areas, but also really help both our urban and rural communities to eat better. Even though we have these agricultural systems, our diet in the US doesn't meet all the dietary requirements, which is bananas, it's crazy. So I think doing things in that space is we have just barely started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what's that saying, like the only thing constant is change or whatever. So I feel like just humans in general tend to resist change, and it's inevitable, right? And so, I think about some of the I guess commitments that some of the major car companies have made around not producing fuel combustion engines by 2030, right? And that's close, that's soon, right? That gives us just a little bit of a runway to ensure that the people who are dependent on that economic system are not left behind. And this speaks, I think, a little bit to what Josh, you've talked about often. And so I see it as our responsibility to ensure that the people who are currently a part of that system, right? So the farmers that are growing corn for ethanol, the industries that are processing that corn for ethanol, those are two pretty significant subsets of Linn County, right? And so I think it's our responsibility to ensure that we're creating options for them, for farmers, for farmers that are currently farming, for new farmers that want to grow different types of food. We need to be creating pathways for them to be able to do that. And it's, and part of that is just like, is economic, it's based in economics, right? If Cargill and ADM and some of our biggest CO2 emitters, but also some of our biggest contributors to our tax base, if their portfolio is being changed, then that has an impact on all of us. And the good news is that young farmers want to grow food. There are young people who are excited about growing food, farm to table food in Linn County, and I know in Johnson County as well. I know that Johnson County is actually leading this a bit more than Linn County. So I think that to me is, the pieces are there. You know what I mean? And so it's not something that we have to be totally concerned about, because I do see this, as most things that seem on face value to be challenges, as an opportunity, right? And so we already see nonprofits like Feed Iowa First really embracing this local food model, right? And it checks so many boxes. It improves health for our local communities. It reduces the distance that we have to transport food. It reduces the distance that we have to transport other things to produce that food, right? And so it allows us to build into or develop a localized, not only food system, but economy based too. So it's a larger question than, again, we have, in my opinion, a decade to really shore up some of these systems. But all of the pieces are there. And I think it's just a matter of investing in the community organizations, in the young farmers and the transitional farmers that want to start growing local food. And, part of that, I don't know, I'm sure you know about this, Craig, because it was an article in the Gazette, I believe, but the hemp farming restriction, right? And so I asked this question, I think my understanding is that we can't grow more than 40 acres of hemp, which is, if anyone on this call knows the reason for that cutoff, I would like to know it, because for my research, I can't find anything specific. And, it does feel tied back to the 40 acres and the mule kind of mentality. And even when I look at, try and figure out what why 40 acres was the cutoff then, it's 400,000 acres in total. So the math just seemed easy, right? But what's that reason now? And if it is profitable to farmers, if it is good for the land, then why should we not be able to grow more? And that is something that, the more of us that are aware of that, we can start to actually advocate at a state level to get some of those restrictions changed to, again, not only help the land, but help our people too.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that 40 acres is a state requirement or a federal requirement. That the hemp was allowed under the Farm Bill, the latest version of the Farm Bill, and states had to submit a plan to be approved under the Farm Bill. And I can't remember whether the 40 acres was originated from USDA or whether that was from the state, but it was part of the regulations to start this. We have less than 10 minutes left here. Time flies by. I do want to ask people about what are some of the signs that Iowans should look for to see whether we're making progress in environmental justice? What are some of the qualities or characteristics if we lived in a environmental just community, and we had knowing that we're going to have more natural disasters, and people are going to be affected by them? What are some of the characteristics or qualities that people should look at to say, yes, we're making progress on this? Or is it something that you never stop working at? It just goes on forever, like so many other things. Is there some kind of sign that would say, this is what we want to achieve, or this is the goal we want to meet, and we'll know when we get there? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, I do think this is like many other things that you're always going to need to be working on it. But I also think that you can set up, and we should be setting up specific metrics on this, right? I mean, going back to the tree canopy and looking, I know in Des Moines that there are parts of our community where that tree canopy is lacking. And we've set a goal, and we talk about environmental justice in our urban forestry master plan, but measuring us and seeing actually how we do as a city, where those trees are planted, if we're meeting our goals. It's the same type of thing across policy after policy, right? What are we doing from, are we actually making progress on water quality, which as a state, we at the state level, they talk about the nutrient reduction strategy, and we're going backwards, right? I mean, I got to live another 150 years to see that plan work at the pace it's going. So we have all sorts of ways that we can actually track whether or not things are getting better. Is our water getting cleaner? I mean, that's not hard to measure. And the impacts, if they're going to be disproportionate, we're going to see that too. So we've actually got to see real progress, not what we're seeing today.
I think that Josh is absolutely right, and I think we need to have different. This is a continuous work, right? And we need to have indicators at the local level versus the state level. I would certainly say that just looking at water quality and, for example, how many utilities have to deal with high nitrate levels, right? And how that has actually been an increasing problem for a lot of smaller utilities, that has a lot of implications for environmental justice in the state. That's not something we need to dedicate new money and have task forces. Look at the sign of that water quality, that direction, and it will be a pretty telling state level kind of like indicator of the fact that we don't even have numeric nutrient criteria in the state is a pretty good indicator that we're not going in the right direction in Iowa, actually.
We did an investigation back in, I want to say 2017 or 2018, we called Treading Water, which is on this very issue that despite the fact that we've spent millions and millions of dollars on improving water quality, there's really been no discernible progress made. And and obviously a lot of different states contribute to the dead zone and the Gulf of Mexico, and we're one of them. But they have essentially punted the goal to make that smaller down the line because nobody's meeting that goal. And so, yes, that has been a real issue. In the few minutes we have left here, I want to ask a question about looping back to the whole Iowa Ideas concept of what can Iowans do on the issue of environmental justice? If somebody's watching us today and they said, I want to make a difference, do you have any advice for what a person could do? Familiarize themselves with the issue, make a commitment to something. What would you recommend that ordinary Iowans do on the environmental justice issue? And we have 3 minutes left. So does anybody want to try to take that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to build coalitions, right? And so that we need all of our groups, the NAACP, the Sunrise Movement, the Sierra Clubs, the Nature Conservancy, all of these groups need to be working in concert, because environmental justice, the environmental movement, climate action is not the work of one entity or one individual or one government or whatever. It's the work for all of us. And all of us have something to give in that work. And we all have various capacities, right, to do that work. And sometimes, it's having a coffee with someone who, has never thought about climate change before, and listening to them to figure out what they care about. And I'm sure if you do that for long enough, you're going to find a connection to climate action. And the more that we can do that, it's a slow play, right? But the more that we can do that, all of us doing that collectively, the better we're going to be set up to address one of the biggest issues facing humanity.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all our panelists here. We're out of time, although I think we could easily spend another hour or two talking about everything, all the topics. But thank you very much for your time here today. I know everybody's busy, and it's very important to take the time out for this. I'm so glad you did. We have a little bit more of Iowa Ideas to go today, and I hope that everybody is going to be able to watch Peggy Whitson do the closing keynote shortly. She is from Iowa. She was the first female commander of the International Space Station. She holds the the American in space longest record, and she's preparing to go back into space again. And she is a rock star in the STEM world, and she's quite a get. And I'm glad she's joining us later this morning. So thank you very much, and I'll see everybody later. Have a good rest of the Iowa Ideas.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.